The grass was still and remained damp from the previous day's rain as the sky awoken with the mild gloom of a new-morn sun. Butch sat patiently on the side of the road with me as we awaited the arrival of the school bus. The moment he began to pant, he'd roll over in the grass to pick up the small globes of water off the end of the leaflet's tops to temporarily cool down his muscular body. It was expected of a dog that size to generate such heat. Mrs. Jankowski was on her front porch, watching her dog and I as we waited for the arrival of the bus. She'd ask the same question every morning as though it wasn't obvious by the large back-bending bag that I carried, which was easily saturated full of in-depth literature contextual books, which I would never end up reading.
Are you off to school, Derek?
Yes, ma'am, I would reply in the same routine tone as each passing day. Today, however, I really wasn't down for the whole school business. My sister had already left after seeing me trot across the lawn towards the bus stop, and had it not have been for Mrs. Jan, who watched over me until I boarded the bus, I probably would have just returned home. There were too many things I wasn't looking forward to. A test that I didn't study for, which was one thing, but I always had my ways around that. Another was a meeting that Miss Kendleton had set up with my sister, and, man, was I going to regret that. It didn't really matter what her intentions were, or what she was going to say, just that every minute she spoke to my sister, Kristen would grow aggravated over the fact somebody was taking up her time. I would be to blame for all of Miss Kendleton's intrusive questions, which was a guaranteed occurrence in such a formal and remote setting as her office lounge. Next was Dylan. I wasn't sure if he was still going to be mad at me for the other day. Maybe it was because I dragged him into football and he really didn't want to do it. I didn't know, nor did I want to know. I just wanted us to be friends again, and a long silent bus ride wouldn't be a fun time for anyone. On top of that issue would be Sean, our coach, whose high hopes for me in the game of football would cause him to keep an eye out for me after school to ensure I'd make it to practice. I was really the only thing he was looking forward to in the game. If it really came down to it, I would skip flag football. Not just for Dylan's sake, but because I had to. I was told to. I was revealing too much. I could hear the bus coming down the street, driving at a near double the speed limit, and its old weathered braking system let out sharp explosive bursts of air as it tried to grinding the wheels to a halt. The large vehicle stopped precisely where I was standing, with the double bifold doors in front of me. My hair blew back at its arrival, and I had to put one foot out to balance against the gusting wind that blew over me. Butch wagged his tail and looked up to me, knowing I had to leave, and would not return for at least another 6 hours. I patted him on the head one last time before I rose from the ground and shuffled my bag onto my back. The great yellow doors parted before me. "Get in here, trooper! Them flat eyes are closing in quick," Grover shouted, his loud and energetic voice causing Butch to howl out from behind me. I walked into the bus and passed the old man without a thought. He closed up the door behind me and slammed his foot on the gas pedal to propel the bus as fast as possible to the next bus stop, which was only a few yards away. Dylan was in the back, already in our self-proclaimed seat, and I was curious to see if he still held the same grudge from the previous day. It was hard for me to tell as the bus was swarming with thoughts and words, and it became near impossible to decipher spoken sentences from fluid thoughts. I continued through the bus, stepping over backpacks that were thrown into the center aisle from Grover's aggressive driving tactics. The bus tilted, and I grabbed onto the seats to my side to hold myself up as the bus took a sharp turn at an unsafe speed. Old Man Groves never was willing to wait until we took our seats before the plane took off again. It was comforting to see Dylan slide to the end of the seat and wave me in as I tried to get to the back of the bus as fast as possible. He gripped onto the bottom of the seat to hold himself in place as I stumbled down the aisle in an accelerated pace. When I nearly arrived at the seat, Dylan slid over towards the window, leaving me room to toss my bag into the seat, and then I followed in soon after. "Grover's really crazy today," Dylan remarked. I breathed another sigh of relief that his mind wasn't occupied with yesterday's dilemma. "When is he not?" I asked, unsure if the bus was driving on a roadway or jumping through hyperspace. When the axle gears of the bus quieted down and the screaming of onboard children came to a halt, I told Dylan about the conference Miss Kendleton was having with my sister that day. He looked at me with crooked eyes when I first mentioned that I was seeing one of the school counselors, which most of the antisocial and physically disfigured students were rumored to see on a daily basis. I comforted Dylan by assuring him that I had to meet with her purely as a result of getting in a lunchroom brawl, and that I wasn't going to be one of the thumb twiddling loners seen in her office. "So you're crazy?" Dylan asked. "No," I argued, with a sarcastic hint of aggravation in my throat. "They think I'm angry or something. I don't know." I wasn't angry. Although if Miss Kendleton really had thought that, she'd assume right away that I had got it from my sister when she finally gets the chance to meet her. "I don't want to go," I said with a sigh. "Not with my sister being there." "What does she ask you?" Stupid questions. "T-minus 1 minute till drop," Grover shouted over the bus's speaker system. "Gear up!" An idea dawned on me, and I turned instantly to Dylan. "Hey, let's stay on the bus," I told Dylan, who looked back in confusion. "What?" "Like, let's not get off. Stay on, you know?" I tried to figure the right way of putting it. "Let's skip school." "Huh? Why?" No, I can't do that. My mother would be pissed," Dylan protested as he looked to the front of the bus as though Grover could hear us conspiring from such a distance. "Just this once, she'll never know. That way I don't have to go to that meeting." I begged, tilting my head to incite sympathy as though making a pleading with my sister. "Just this once?" I tried what I could to get Dylan excited over the matter. The idea sounded great to me. I mean, blowing off a meeting that had two of my life's greatest tormentors in one room? What was not to like? But Dylan was not so thrilled over the matter, as he really didn't see any benefit in it. "And we'll miss football." I know he wanted to hear that. Even though there was nothing stopping him from not going in the first place, he would still be pressured to go if I was heading off to the field after school. "Well, I guess," Dylan managed to slip out when I jumped out of the seat in joy. "What are we gonna do?" I got an idea. As the bus came to a grinding halt, all the kids on board were thrown forward together in one giant movement. After bouncing headfirst off the seat in front of them, each student got up from the ground and dug through the pile of fallen backpacks in order to find their own, before they scrambled to get off the bus as Grover was spinning his arm like a windmill in his traditional evacuation procedure. Dylan and I, however, did not. Instead, after bracing ourselves against the tall seat in front of us, we collapsed onto the ground and threw our bags onto the bus seats along with our bodies. Dylan positioned himself under the last seat in the bus, while I scrambled under the one in front of him, and using my foot I kicked the bags amidst the chaos, right under the next two seats in front of me. It'd do the trick, I thought. I had never realized how long it took to get all the students off the bus, as Dylan and I, despite being in the back, would usually climb our way over the crowd to the front of the bus in a few easy seconds. We sat there on the cold, dusty floor as kids juggled bags in the hopes of finding their own. Globs of pre-chewed gum were stuck to the bottom of the seats, and I pried one off and lobbed it at Dylan to lighten the mood as we waited for the bus to clear. He smiled, and I threw it back. He threw it back. His nerves were tensed, and he wasn't so sure about doing this. But every time he saw the calm look on my face, it put him at ease. I put my finger to my mouth to tell him to remain quiet, although he seemed to be doing a better job at it than I. The entire bus went silent as all the students had successfully made it off, and Grover's thick, steel-bottomed military boots were crashing down off his seat, and he began to march through the center aisles of the bus, like a pacing drill sergeant. He was looking for lost items that may have been thrown across the bus during the dive bomb, as his mind put it. I did not know he was going to do this. As his heavy boots took one step after another, I grew nervous. He was getting closer to the back of the bus, and his sudden stops to look in between the seats were creating a terrible sense of suspense. Once in a while, he'd stop and pick up something in the cracks of a seat and murmur something to himself, usually involving long, outdated Oriental racial slurs. "Damn punks!" Grover shouted at the top of his lungs, and nearly knocked my head off at the bottom of the seat from his expulsion, thinking we were discovered. "I don't remember this here wound there, Betsy. I'm gonna patch this up real good, baby girl, You hear me?" Grover spoke to himself, or was he speaking to the seat? Grover leaned in and began stroking the bus seat, shedding a tear over an unintentional gash that was drawn into the fabric. He scrambled over to the front of the bus, pulled out a large roll of duct tape, and carefully and methodically placed it over the open cut, while speaking softly to the inanimate chair. "After all we've been through together, I won't just let you up and die on me." Dylan was thinking the same thing I was. What the hell was he doing? I turned to Dylan, covering my mouth as I couldn't help but laugh, and indicated for him to stay silent. Grover's feet turned sharply, and for a second I thought he had heard me. He took 3 quick steps, and I tightened up, trying to stay hidden under the seat as he closed in on me. Then he stopped, and my bag, 2 seats in front of me, slid out from under his hiding spot as Grover grabbed a hold of its shoulder strap. He said nothing more than a grunt and threw the bag toward the front of the bus without concern for its contents. There wasn't much I cared for in that bag, and Grover's simple narrative mindset informed me that he just assumed somebody had forgotten it, as had been done so many times in the past. His search continued, and the suspense started all over again. His next step forward had him scan both sides of the bus, including the seat where Dylan's bag was under, which he missed. His search continued, and his large boot came crashing down to the ground, a foot from my head, and I crawled into a ball against the bus wall far underneath the seat. Grover saw me. He nearly bent down to investigate what he thought he saw was a boy, until his mind was wiped blank. I am not here. Grover's head straightened, and he looked out the back window of the bus, with squinting eyes where another idle bus was waiting. He shook his head left and right in quick, whipping motions, distressed over the matter of forgetting his train of thought. Gosh dang it, I shouldn't have had them drinks. Grover stomped back to the front of the bus and crashed into the driver's seat. Let's get you back to the shop, old gal. Grover spoke to the bus, before reaching for the large door lever handle and slamming it back. Here we go! The ride was just as bumpy as it was on the way to school. Dylan and I had sat through the first half of the trip under the seats with our arms wrapped over our heads to protect ourselves from the sudden knocks into the steel welding above us. Soon after receiving a few bruises, we slid out from underneath the seats and just sat on the ground near one another. Where is he going now? Dylan whispered, as he tried to sit as still as possible, despite the torques and turns the bus underwent. His backpack had long since came out of hiding and slid around the bottom of the bus like a mouse would throughout a vacant house. I began. I don't know. Grover's subconscious memory of where he was going made it hard to recognize the route he was taking, as the routine memorization was below the surface of the impulsive imaginations of his active mind. His thoughts were confusing, oftentimes taking strange forms of realism and then falling back to fictional understandings, blending the two incoherently with one another. In the mind of Grover, something as simple as a streetlight would appear as the indicating jump light as a paratrooper's drop plane, and it was near impossible to distinguish the difference between the two. I didn't dwell in the psychotic abyss for long. I tried rising out of the pocket in between the 2 seats in order to see what was in the outside world, though nothing more than trees were about. The bus turned sharply, throwing us out into the center aisle and in view of Grover's giant overhead mirror. I looked into its reflection, seeing Grover holding onto the steering wheel with 2 wide-stretched arms that spun it like it was the helm of a great ship. Both Dylan and I scrambled back into our hiding position before Grover could catch sight of us. A sudden and forceful stop had sucked us under the seat in front of us. "Land ho!" shouted Grover, as he jumped up from his seat and took 2 lengthy strides out of the side door of the bus. "Where's me old hound dog?" A distant barking could be heard as Dylan and I looked over at each other, wondering where it was Grover had brought us. I had made a bold and daring attempt to look out the side window, and all I could see was the back of Grover walking towards a long trailer with a black, short-furred dog by his side. A crooked telephone pole was erected beside the trailer, and thick cables streamed down from its top into a mobile home. The remaining area looked like nothing short of a giant sandbox with large-scaled toys, or in other words, broken-down vehicles scattered throughout. Trees were on the horizon, blocking off any view of possible civilizations nearby. Through the windows on the other side of the bus was only the rocky, unpaved roadway that led us here. "Whoa!" both Dylan and I exclaimed at the same time. "Where are we?" I scratched my head curiously. "Are we in another country?" Dylan asked as I tried to find an answer. I don't think so. This is Grover's home," I told Dylan, thinking of nothing better to say. I guess it should have been obvious, but I couldn't possibly understand how someone could live in a place like this. It was a desert, to put it shortly, and amidst the center of the sand dunes was a shack-sized motorhome that was half buried in the sandy ground. The place felt fictitious to me, and having never seen such a place, I assumed we were a great deal away from home, despite the relatively brief time it took me to get here. Grover stepped into his shack, nearly breaking off a thin screen door that hung off a single hinge. His dog followed behind him, but hesitated for a brief moment, stopping outside the door and looking over its back.
How are we ever going to get home?
Dylan asked, his voice sounding very concerned over the matter. I knelt down next to him.
Think about it. Grover has to drive the bus back to pick up the other kids from school. Then he will drop them off at their houses, like always. That is when we can get off and get back home. But that won't happen for another 6 hours.
A dog was barking from outside the bus, and I peeked out the window to catch a glimpse. The feral dog, who was hardly familiar with the human race, was outside, cocking its head back like the barrel of a gun, with each resounding bark. It bared its teeth and growled at the sight of me, and in that moment, I knew it had seen me, and wanted me torn to shreds for having trespassed on its property.
Oh, crap!
I instantly cursed before dropping back onto the ground. The dog saw me. Dylan quickly rose to the window, as if not believing what I had said. I saw an expressive remark cast across his face, and he dropped back down right beside me.
Grover's coming too!
Dylan's eyes grew in fear. I had to do something. The dog ran into the bus, barking aggressively as it blocked the front exit. It growled in hostility as it scented our flesh and scanned the area for sight of us. It patiently awaited the arrival of its owner before it took any further action. "What is it, old hound dog? Them goods aboard of me ship?" Grover's heavy boots were heard ascending the stairs to the bus.
Run, scatter, leave, hide.
The dog dropped low, bringing its tail in between his legs, before it ran out of the bus whimpering as though bitten by a rabid animal. "Nah, you damn deadheads did it," Grover grumbled, and I seized up at the hostile thought running through his head. Our bus driver's long and lengthy legs slapped down the heavy and burdening boots on his feet as he tried to make for the quickest pace an old frail man could conjure. Both Dylan and I felt him coming and reeled back in the corner of the seat without having enough time to dive into our cover position. We looked at each other for a brief second, our oval eyes indicating to one another that we both were stricken in fear when Grover came into view. I jumped back, crashing into the steel wall behind me. Dylan and I wrapped our arms around each other and screamed as Grover stood over us with a large machete in hand. Grover looked down at the two screaming boys huddled in the corner and cocked his head in wonder. It took him a brief second before he looked up into his raised right hand, where he saw a rusty machete awaiting, and then realized the reason behind their terror. He looked around for a place to put it, as both Dylan and I were still expelling the air out of our lungs, and he quickly lobbed the rigid blade out of the window. "Calm down, I says. Calm your darn tootin' selves down," Grover shouted over us, and when Dylan and I drew short of breath, we went silent. We sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, staring wide-eyed at Grover, as the adrenaline from the act of being discovered had not yet completely subsided. Grover scratched his chin where an old gray and ragged goatee hung. "Now what are you boys still doing on the bus?" Grover asked. Dylan and I turned to each other, just realized that we were cuddling in each other's arms, and we instantly broke free, pushing each other away with a disgusted look on our face. I looked at Grover, who still awaited an answer, all the while trying to figure out if he had done something stupid enough that would have resulted in us ending up here. We forgot to get off," I said, without much convincing. Grover shot his head to the front of the bus and made a giant leap over Dylan's bag with his lengthy legs. "Gosh darn it! I have got to get you back there in a jiffy," Grover shouted as he fumbled his keys in hand and tried slamming them into the ignition. I pushed out of the seat, running after Grover before he could start the engine. "But we don't have to go back," I shouted, my remark causing Grover to drop his keys. "Can you just bring us home instead?" Grover turned to me with a concerning look on his face before he drew his head back as though my breath stunk of something foul. "You telling me, boy, that you're some run-off-the-mill soldier?" "We're not soldiers." Grover looked down into his palm for a moment, as though trying to figure out what reality he was in. He brought his open hands to his head and ran them over his eyes, as though delivering refreshing water to his old, crinkly face. "You're right there, sonny. But I still had me a mission, and I messed it up good. I always had. Grover's ain't what he used to be, kid. Grove's getting too old for this dilly-dally." I took a step closer. I didn't know what Grover meant, or what he was speaking about, but I could feel his sorrow. He was lost, and could only remember a distant and foggy past that would make sudden flashbacks, confusing him with the current day. I placed my hand on his shoulder to provide what comfort I could, but it inadvertently threw me into his world. Thoughts collided and intercepted with one another, breaching from the grounds of remembrance into the forefront of perceptive reality. Long stretching nerve cells coiled and muddled into one massive group, pulsing with the synaptic firings of a distant messenger, distorting the original context of the action. Things became lost, and the organized transit through the memory centers of the brains were meshed into a disfigured pile of indecipherable mess. It was the onset of dementia, and the confusing interpretation of our surroundings was not only a problem for Grover, but it made my understanding of it all far more difficult. All that I knew was that life could never be the same for him. The things we take for granted, the simplistic and routine executions of the actions we all so fondly know, all become an unfamiliar and impossible task when faced with what Grover has. Grover was dying, and I could feel it. Dad given me old Groves a job to do. I was to do one thing, hear me, sonny. 'Twas to get you off to school and on time, and I's done gone off and screwed it up. Gosh darn it, old Groves lost it this time. I looked back at Dylan. He was slowly making his way up the bus, and I wasn't sure if he heard what Grover was rambling about, but I knew it had to be done. Grover needed another chance. Lowering my head in thought, I could not proceed as planned. It would be easy for me to get old Grover to drive us home, but that would have only made things worse. I had to help him in the only way that I knew I could. I had to make him succeed in the one task that meant so much to him. I looked down at Grover, who sat in his seat, still staring off at his hands. I grabbed the closest hand to me, a large and rugged palm with long, thin, and shaky fingers. I cupped it in both my hands and brought it up to my chest to draw Grover's face to mine. Grover, I asked, can you bring us back to school? He looked up at me with confusion in his eyes. Nobody will know we were late. All you have to do is get us there. Dat one old Groves can do, Grover whispered, as though conversing of a secret plot. His head shot up in alert, and he snatched his hand out of my grip to throw a confirming salute. He retrieved the keys to the bus from the ground, where he had dropped them, and plugged them into the ignition, bringing the bus to life. All right, boys. You better buckle in, 'cause this puppy's about to take off.